Hello. So, recently I picked up a Commodore Amiga CD32 from eBay to replace the one I had as a teenager that broke then back in the day. Released in the autumn of 1993, the CD32 was Commodore's make or break console before they went broke. So, short-lived as it was, there's a chance that unless you're big into retro gaming, you may not even have heard of the CD32. But for me, it's a console I loved then as an Amiga fanboy, and I still love to this day as a representation of a transitional time in my gaming life. I played on the CD32 for hours as a teen, but what I knew back then is something I can say with confidence today. As a console, the Amiga CD32 was pretty awful. I remember being excited by the mere prospect of the CD32. I'd already owned an Amiga 1200 and read Amiga magazines every month. So when Commodore released adverts declaring that after Sega's new baby, Amiga brings you the mother, referring of course to the Sega Mega CD released earlier that year in Europe, it said to me that the Amiga was going to make a real attempt at taking on Nintendo and Sega. With the world's first 32-bit console, they would really show them how it's done. Yes, console envy was real in the Amiga scene. The first Amiga had initially been sold as a bit of a graphics powerhouse, with Commodore getting Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry at the launch event to demonstrate what it was capable of. But that was in 1985, and by 1993, Amiga hardware was feeling long in the tooth in comparison to the relatively flashy consoles. Not that the CD32 actually used the same hardware as the original runner machines. The year before the CD32's unveiling, Commodore released the latest in the Amiga line of computers, the Amiga 1200. It sported their new Advanced Graphics Architecture, or AGA, chipset that featured a faster processor, 2 MB of RAM, and the ability to display 256 colours on screen at once. The CD32 was to copy that hardware, swapping the floppy disk drive and the keyboard for a CD-ROM drive. It looked like against a 32-bit CD-based console, the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo couldn't compete. Up until this point, the Amiga never really had their Mario or Sonic equivalent. We'd got Gremlin Zool and 100 other attempts that were often good in their own rights, but nothing ever came that close to the big two. It was the same with fighting games as well, only alongside the wannabe games, the Amiga had actually received ports of Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, but they were... no. Unfortunately, the 1200 showed no signs of reversing that trend, but there was the hope that the CD32 would change that. Spoiler alert though, it didn't. Commercially available games were often ports from the A1200, which in turn had a fair share of AGA versions of older Amiga games, a fine tradition that should be familiar to modern gamers. If you were lucky, then they would have Redbook CD audio added, or a full motion video intro. Besides that, the only thing on offer were games available on other CD systems at the time. The Mega CD, Philips CDI, and 3DO. Oh, before we go any further actually, let me just take a moment to mention the CD32 pad. You would think that since the Amiga line had been limited to one-button joysticks up to this point, that a NES-style pad would be an absolute revelation. Well, no thanks to the D-pad. It was a circular nightmare that made consistently pressing the direction you actually wanted a challenge, with raised bumps that would dig into your fingers. This was made worse by the fact a large number of games didn't make use of the extra buttons, which meant there were far too many platform games that still had the cardinal sin of using up to jump. It made buying a third-party competition Pro pad a must, which is something rather difficult today, with the prices outstripping modern pads for the most part. But anyway, on we go, because come 1994, the gaming landscape changed forever. Doom was released for the IBM-compatible PCs in December of 1993, a scant couple of months after the CD32 launched. And by the spring of 1994, Doom and Doom clones with a hot new flavour. It didn't matter what platform you gamed on, all the people were talking about was Doom. id Software clearly had no interest in developing for the Amiga, so developers set to work on their own take on the new craze. We ended up with games such as Team 17's Alien Breed 3D and Blackmagic Software's Gloom. They were brave attempts, but it very quickly became clear that the Amiga hardware just wasn't capable of throwing pixels around in the manner a game like Doom required. I did play Gloom for hours though, it was actually a lot of fun. Although, how I didn't ruin my eyes with those blocky graphics is beyond me. Not that the CD32 was alone in struggling to deliver Doom-like experiences. Every console of the time had its clones and they all, by and large, came up short. But it was still a huge indication that Amiga hardware was failing to keep pace. The CD32 had been developed as a multimedia machine just like the CD-TV before it, and while multimedia had been a big buzzword in the industry with everyone attempting to make FMV games work, we had just witnessed Doom causing a huge sea change. Commodore had been struggling for years anyway. The joint managing director David Pleasance would in a later interview describe the CD32 as a make or break for the company, and although it made a profit, it just wasn't enough. Commodore would declare bankruptcy on the 29th of April 1994, and that was the end of both the company and the CD32 as a commercial product. I don't think my own CD32 lasted that much longer, gasping its last at some point in 1995. I was devastated. So, considering I've been rather negative about the console so far, I find myself looking back with fondness, even as I recognise its faults and my own disappointment. Nostalgia plays a part there, obviously. Revisiting my games with my newly purchased CD32 is done through the filter of rose-tinted glasses. But the thing is, I felt pretty much the same the first time round. I knew the console was underpowered and basically fighting a losing battle, but I played on it for hours on end, and when it broke, I felt like I'd lost something very special. Part of that is down to the games. As I mentioned earlier, the CD32 took a lot of flack at the time for having a game catalogue that was basically 99% ports from the Amiga 1200. But I found that to be a good thing in the end as I revisited old favourites like D-Generation and the absolute classic Speedball 2, and new favourites like Roadkill, ATR and Shadow Fighter. It also sped up loading times and eliminated disc swapping, so larger games like the beautiful Heimdall 2 and the expansive Liberation made a lot more sense to play on the CD32 over other Amigas. And because the CD32 shared its hardware with the A1200, it was trivial to bring public domain games across. Public domain games were basically the equivalent of today's homebrew and small indie scene. The sort of very small developer games you'll find on itch.io these days. Previously, you'd get a couple of games on a floppy from a magazine, or through the post from a PD distribution house, or maybe from a computer fair. But then, all of a sudden, magazines were putting scores of them on their cover discs, and companies were releasing them on discs by the hundreds. And so, many of them were clones of old arcade games. After all, this is the scene that would see people releasing their first work. Sometimes the games were experimental, sometimes derivative, sometimes plain bad, but most often exciting seeing what crazy ideas people had committed to disc. And after the Amiga, they were a joy lost to me until the resurgence of the indie scene. But, in hindsight, what the CD32 represents to me is a time in my gaming history where everything was changing. CD was the way forward for gaming, but that was the reality not realised until the PlayStation came along. In the meantime, developers were handed more storage space and were trying to figure out what to do with it. FMV titles may have been an evolutionary dead end, but you can see the seeds being planted in the likes of point-and-click adventure games. They suddenly took advantage of the CD by having all the characters fully voiced. For example, in Beneath the Steel Sky, a game I first played on the CD32 and is still a firm favourite of mine all these years later. There's a certain irony in being able to look back at a period of gaming that I found so exciting, right before the mid-90s boom. And no, I couldn't actually recommend the CD32 to anyone beyond retro game enthusiasts. And even then, unless they had a history in Amiga, they're likely to view it as little more than a cult curio. To a lot of people, the CD32 was a failure. To me, it represented a lot more. It was a glimpse to the future of gaming. And even if the CD32 couldn't meet the potential of CD, I knew
our world would never be the same again.
Well, if you're still there, thank you very much for sticking around. This was my first attempt at making a long-form YouTube video, and I do understand the quality's probably not that great. But if for whatever reason you do fancy encouraging me to make more videos, please do think about clicking the like button, and maybe subscribing to my channel. But whatever you choose, thank you very much, and I'll see you later.